Who am I? A scientific answer to an existential question. Who am I? Is an existential question every soul yearns to know. Sadly, there are no shortcut answers to this. Because we are too busy or too lazy, more the latter. With so much time spent on Twitter and TikTok and too little time for anything else, we don't spend time on research to answer such pesky questions. We, instead, resort to shortcuts. We take the path of least resistance, listen to your parents or gurus, and be done with it. This is the established model. I am a big fan of using scientific and logical reasoning to find answers to messy and gooey social questions. Today, I am attempting to arrive at my identity, a seemingly non-scientific topic, through science. Identity is the flavor of the season. Identity politics is reshaping political landscapes all over the world. There is an identity renaissance of sorts globally. It points to a world in a confused transition from the old world. As knowledge floods the world in far higher quantities than earlier, it brings to mind the quote, "Science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom." But, before I commit myself to a group, and its causes, let me first satisfy myself thoroughly that I am indeed in the right group. Is identity my immediate previous generation, or 2 generations ago, 10, 100? As a thought experiment, think how far back you can go in that chain. Most people would only know 1 generation of grandparents. And even if they knew, there was nothing much to fight over. However, there is another identity beyond the personal identity that has been a cause of many wars and conflicts, the group identity. Once people identify with a group as my group, they now adopt the collective history of their group as part of their own identity. The group identity is part history and part folklore and mythology. It is a whole lot of storytelling. Stories glorifying and elevating this group over others. A group identity is given to people primarily by their parents, who remain faithful to it for the rest of their lives. 98% of people die in the same religion they are born in. We can see that an individual carries 2 identities, the individual biological identity and a group identity. In most cases, there is continuity, one neatly feeding into the other, creating a compounding effect. Defending your group gets bundled in with defending your family, your honor, your culture, your country, etc. DNA testing is the most definitive way to ascertain biological identity. You can take that to the court. However, the results are not as clean and tidy as your parents told you. Here is what your parents didn't tell you. We share 99.9% of our DNA with other humans. 98.8% of our DNA with chimps. 94.0% of our DNA with dogs. 90.0% of our DNA with cats, and get this, 60.0% of our DNA with bananas. If there was to be something special about humans, the DNA of humans could have been entirely different from all other species. That is not the case. So there is nothing extraordinary about individual identity, it's just an extension of other life forms on Earth. Anthropology informs us that man is a social primate and behaves like one, forming groups to fight with other groups. Great many Homo sapiens will resist being called a primate but have no problem behaving like one. Anthropology also informs us how modern humans originated a couple of 100,000 years ago and how we lived as hunter-gatherers, transitioned to agricultural communities, etc. The story is long, ever-changing and convoluted. Even the history of modern nations has many twists and turns with several waves of immigration, invasions, imposed religions, caste systems, etc., evidence of which can be found in our DNA. It is so messy as to cause you a headache. Fascinating to read as a story of the past. But to assume any particular sliver of that is my identity and only that sliver is ridiculous. Lorem ipsum. I am a collective outcome of all of that, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Many African Americans have white ancestry, many times a legacy of rape, in their DNA. Are they to pick one part of their genetic legacy and celebrate it and hate the other? What kind of life would that be? Of course, to bypass all the science and evidence that is staring us in our faces, and to elevate the status of this group, identity beyond logic, reason and questioning, divinity is claimed, which has served as a potent tool and only bypassed to the logical mechanisms operating in the brain warning us constantly. Divinity is used to silence the inner voice of reason. So, at the end of this exercise, I have arrived at 2 things. 1. My biological identity is intertwined with the rest of the species on this planet. I am part of the universal biological fabric of the world. I am 1% more human than a chimpanzee. 2. Group identity as a narrative. The dominant segment of that narrative can be whatever you choose to believe in. It does not change the convoluted history of millennia from which we have descended. There is no specific culture we belong to. Each of us have had ancestors that were hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, agrarian, irreligious, religious, converted from one religion to another and whatnot. It is most certainly not a neatly narrated monolith on a manicured timeline. Once again, only science allows one to arrive at an objective conclusion on this matter. Everything else diverges, whereas science converges to a logical answer. There is no replacement for learning science and developing rational and logical reasoning to improve your objectivity. Otherwise, we will forever be condemned as slaves to the narratives of social primate groups and their leaders. To the decent people out there, when you hear a voice of reason, please reshare, repost and promote it. If you don't like what I say, please say that to me. Don't be quiet. The world suffers a lot. Not because of the violence of bad people, but because of the silence of the good people. Given these themes, I am personally pessimistic that the mind can be used to figure out the answer to, who am I? This does not mean that the mind is totally useless when it comes to answering the question. As mentioned earlier, we can certainly make some broad generalizations about ourselves through gaining familiarity with findings in psychology and through introspection. Further, we can also come to understand, though the use of the mind, that the mind has its limits, especially when it comes to self-enquiry. So, is there any alternative way of getting to know oneself? To me, a particularly alluring alternative is that of going beyond the mind. Almost all spiritual traditions involve a practice of silence that encourages exploring the space of no thought. The idea is to switch off the mind such that you can get to know the reality, as it is, that is, perceiving reality without the filter of the mind. Is there any merit to this idea? Is it possible to experience anything without the mind? And what would you find out about who you are if you experienced the state of no mind? There's only one way to know for sure, by experiencing the state of no mind for yourself. Finally, we, like reality itself, may be too complex and dynamic to be fully understood through our finite minds. To be sure, we can make some relatively accurate broad-stroke generalizations about ourselves, e.g., it is unlikely that I will ever smoke, or, I like Indian food better than I like English food. But one should be cautious in coming to much more specific conclusions about oneself. We like to believe that we, and others around us, have relatively stable likes and dislikes, and traits. Mostly, we like to think of ourselves as well-meaning, smart, and talented, a phenomenon known as the self-serving bias or the Lake Wobegon effect. But, as studies on priming have repeatedly shown, our personality isn't as stable as we think it is. In general, we exhibit many more shades of saintliness and sinfulness, introversion and extroversion, cowardliness and bravery, love and hate, vengefulness and forgiveness, etc. than we think we do. The truth is that we are not one person, but many people in one. In fact, the most accurate way to think of ourselves is that we exist as a broad set of potentialities, rather than as a narrow set of traits. The particular trait we manifest at any point in time depends on the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Thus, as Miller's famous findings showed, even normal people like you and me, are capable of delivering fatal electric shocks to others. Likewise, as Zimbardo's findings showed, even normal people can turn into mean-spirited disciplinarians under the right conditions. This means that it may not be possible to know ourselves to any meaningful level of specificity. We can only know ourselves at a relatively abstract and vague level, as a portfolio of possibilities.